Forensic science begins at the end of someone else's story. Scrutinizing a violent moment in time. Samples are collected and preserved. The scene exhaustively photographed. Evidence prepared for forensic experts to examine. Television and movies fuel blind faith in the power of crime scene investigations, or CSI. But since the emergence of DNA analysis, a disturbing trend has emerged. DNA, pulled from evidence that spent decades gathering dust, has revealed a surprising number of wrongful convictions. In fact, in hundreds of exoneration cases, DNA did more than free the innocent. It proved that the forensic evidence that convicted them was wrong. It's time to put CSI on trial, to find out what's real science, what has scientific potential, and what's just junk. The stakes couldn't be higher.
My name is Keith Harward. I was wrongly convicted for 33 years. These expert witnesses were willing to have me put to death behind what they said.
September 14th, 1982. A man wearing a U.S. Navy white service uniform breaks into the Newport News, Virginia home of the Perone family. He bludgeons 30-year-old Jesse Perone to death. Then sexually assaults 22-year-old Teresa, threatening to kill her 3 children if she makes a sound. Hours later, he makes his escape, leaving behind a horrific calling card.
She had been bitten all over her legs. They had a police photographer come and take photographs of the bite marks.
Kenny Murov was a young defense attorney in Newport News at the time.
She could not identify the man. She heard his voice. She knew he was a Caucasian male. She thought he was clean-shaven.
And he wore a sailor's uniform. Teresa Perone was able to describe the insignia on the sleeve, 3 upside-down V's. Perone also recalled seeing a sailor acting suspiciously outside her home the afternoon before the attack. And she worked with police to develop a composite sketch. The Perone home was located just down the street from a shipyard where a Navy vessel, the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson, was docked. The police conducted an unusual search.
In the mess halls, they had these dentists, and they lined everybody up, and they kind of ran them through there.
At the time, Keith Harward was a 26-year-old seaman stationed on the Carl Vinson.
They looked in the mouths and looked to see, what they were looking for, which at the time I had no clue what it was.
They were looking for teeth that matched the bite marks in the photographs of Teresa Perone's legs. Several hundred sailors were singled out to give their dental impressions to the authorities, but Harward was excluded.
At the time, I had no clue. Didn't care because, whatever they were doing didn't involve me.
Several months passed. The police were no closer to solving the crime, and the pressure to find a suspect was mounting. Then they got what they thought was a break. Another bite mark case. Keith Harward had a girlfriend named Gladys.
Gladys reported that she had a fight with a boyfriend, and in the course of making that report, she said he bit me. It was a true tussle.
Roy Lazarus was a defense attorney in Newport News.
It wasn't in the nature of a rape. He wasn't biting her on her thigh. It was just they're fighting with one another, and they apparently did that. But the nature of the bite was just simply in a defensive nature.
It was just like out of frustration, I bit her. It wasn't right to start with, but she was talked into going to the hospital by the police.
To the police, a bite was a bite, a savage and unusual act. They figured Harward must be their man.
That was it. There was no turning back. They were looking for an easy way out, and I turned out to be it.
The authorities sent a cast of Harward's teeth to a dental expert and rising star in the burgeoning field of bite mark analysis named Lowell Levine. Levine claimed that Harward's teeth matched the marks on Perron's legs, and the police began building their case around him.
They kept telling me they had eyewitnesses and fingerprints, and I kept telling them they didn't know what the hell they talked about.
But there was an eyewitness.
A shipyard guard named Donald Wade. And Donald Wade observed somebody in the early morning hours of the crime, a Navy person coming through his gate with blood on his uniform.
The police showed Wade a series of photographs.
And he identified Keith as being the guy that came through the gate.
But the victim couldn't pick Keith out.
She couldn't identify me. She couldn't identify me as her rapist.
His mustache didn't line up with her recollection of a clean-shaven attacker, nor did his uniform insignia look like upside-down V's.
Keith was not of that rank. He had 3 stripes and not 3 inverted V's.
The investigation was a torturous process leading to what we call a direct indictment of Keith Harward.
Despite the weak and contradictory evidence, the case went to trial. Murov represented Harward, who testified in his own defense.
It's somewhat unusual for a defendant charged with this serious of a crime to testify, but from the first time I met him, Keith said he didn't commit this offense. So I had to respect his request. He made himself a real person, not some, evil ogre, so to speak. He humanized himself.
But the testimony of bite mark analysts was equally powerful. Lowell Levine told the jury that everybody has a set of teeth which are unique and individual, that with reasonable medical certainty, Mr. Harward caused the bite marks on the leg. A second expert echoed Levine's testimony. The defense challenged both experts with the fact that they based their statements on a single photograph.
Every other piece of evidence that was presented at the trial was exculpatory. There was no hair evidence, there was no fingerprint evidence, there was no blood evidence, there were no semen samples that implicated him.
In October 1983, Keith Harward awaited his fate.
I was numb. I didn't hear much of what's going on. I knew it was coming. I just felt it. You know you didn't do it, but everybody's saying you did do it.
In the case of first-degree capital murder, guilty.
What can you do?
First-degree rape,
What do you do?
guilty.
The jury sentenced him to life in prison.
Now, what convicted me, I don't think, and others don't think, was not the actual bite marks. It was the background, the list of credentials of being a president of this and being on this board of New York City.
The people who claimed to be the experts were self-aggrandizing, who made up stuff as they went along because that's what they had to do, to say that a bite mark is as good as a fingerprint when they really had no basis for making that claim.
I'm going to do a clinical examination just to make sure.
Bite mark practitioners were, by and large, regular dentists with an interest in crime solving.
He attempted to discredit the process of bite mark identification, but when you have a unique fraternity of dentists for the sole purpose of assisting law enforcement in its investigations, it just has instant credibility. Hard to overcome in 1983.
Levine, who had been president of the American Association of Forensic Science, had gained notoriety for being one of the dentists who gave bite mark testimony at the trial of serial killer Ted Bundy.
So I think if he had said to the jury in the middle of October, "It's snowing outside right now," I think they would have believed him.
If the expert appears to be well-trained and has sufficient experience, jurors will defer to the expert's conclusions.
A professor at Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law, Jay Kohler researches criminal forensics.
Some studies show that jurors don't particularly care about whether the methods used by the experts have been scientifically tested or not. Instead, they're generally content to trust the credentialed, experienced expert.
After Harward's trial, it came to light that the state used a controversial investigative technique.
What I did not know is that they had hypnotized Donald Wade.
Investigators used this highly suggestible technique to help refresh the security guard's memory. And it wasn't only used on the guard.
What I also did not know is they hypnotized Teresa Perone before they interviewed her and before her testimony. This is highly irregular and highly improper not to have disclosed this to defense counsel.
Harward served 3 years in prison before the state Supreme Court reversed his conviction on a legal technicality. But his second trial was much like the first.
Nothing pointed to Keith, and everything pointed away from Keith.
Roy Lazarus represented Harward in the retrial. But Keith wasn't holding out hope for a different verdict.
I faced reality. I was being railroaded again.
The jury pronounced him guilty and sentenced him for a second time to life. Keith set out to make a life behind bars.
I accepted my fate and said, okay, what can I do? Kept a job, stayed busy as much as I could, doing little things.
Bede was always optimistic, not in terms of, I'm going to get out of this, but just in terms of life is going to deal to me what life is going to deal to me.
I was just waiting for the day I dropped dead. They were going to never let me go.
For 25 years, Harward survived each day.
But I had a chance to sit inside and observe what was going on outside. I had no dog in the hunt. I don't care who's president. I don't care what the new color, the black is the new orange, or whatever. It didn't affect me.
When another inmate suggested he contact the Innocence Project, a nonprofit that works to exonerate the wrongly convicted, Keith figured he had nothing to lose.
He said, you know, your case is so screwy, you ought to write these people and see if they can help you.
2 years later, Chris Fabricant joined the Innocence Project as Director of Strategic Litigation.
I was learning about the leading contributing factors to wrongful conviction, and bite marks rose to the top.
Keith's case wasn't the only one.
And so we started looking at them and started trying to find every single case that we could possibly find.
I get a letter from the Innocence Project stating, we want to take up your case.
After 3 decades, the evidence box for Harward's case was still sitting on a shelf. Upon examination, they discovered a piece of potentially exonerating evidence.
The forensic examiner on the blood noted that there were certain types of secretions that would not have been consistent with Keith's blood type. And they didn't disclose that. That's huge.
His new defense team obtained a court order for DNA testing, science that hadn't existed at the time of his original trial. The analysis definitively excluded Harward as the source of blood and semen from the crime scene. Just as he had always claimed, he was innocent. But the DNA did more than exonerate Harward. It identified the actual culprit.
A very bad criminal by the name of Jerry Crotty, who was a multiple offender. There was a solid match on him as being the perpetrator. He was a crew member with Keith. He was on the Vinson.
Crotty died in an Ohio prison in 2006. In 2016, the Virginia Supreme Court issued Harward a writ of actual innocence.
The writ of innocence was granted on a 7-0 vote. There was no dissents.
He walked out of prison a free man for the first time in 33 years.
You're like in a coma. I was in a coma.
I've never done this before. Y'all have to give me a break. This is all new to me.
And I was awoken, April 7th, 2016.
I'm not the criminal. They weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a conviction. And they knew.
The DNA that proved Keith was innocent also proved that all of the bite mark testimony in the case had to be wrong.
They were wrong because bite mark evidence has no basis in science whatsoever. They were wrong because it's bad science.
So where did this discipline begin, and how did it end up in the courtroom? The story is older than America itself. The earliest reporting of bite mark evidence in court dates back to the Salem witch trials. In 1692, the Reverend George Burroughs stood accused of witchcraft and conspiracy with the devil. Several young girls claimed the possessed Burroughs had bitten them. He was forced to let the court examine his teeth. They decreed that his bite matched the bite marks, and he was hanged. But it wasn't until 300 years later that bite marks entered the modern justice system. In 1974, prosecutors exhumed the body of a murder victim to examine bite marks on her nose, evidence which led to a conviction. This set the precedent, the legal rule that has allowed bite mark testimony into U.S. courtrooms. Then, the serial killer case that shocked the nation made bite mark evidence famous. In 1978, police arrested Theodore Bundy, a clean-cut former law student, for numerous kidnappings, rapes, and murders.
It was the first nationally broadcast live criminal trial. He was a huge celebrity defendant.
Bite mark analysis took the spotlight at trial, when forensic odontologists matched Bundy's teeth to the bite marks on one of his victims.
And it made the dentist stars.
In practice, bite mark analysts match a suspect's dental impressions to marks of an injury on a victim's skin. It's based on two fundamental assumptions: that skin can reliably record tooth marks, and that the arrangement and condition of an individual's teeth are unique, like a fingerprint. But these fundamental principles have never been proven, and for 4 decades, bite mark analysis has been used in court without scientific validation of its basic assumptions. Bite marks fall under the umbrella of forensic odontology, a discipline mostly known for victim identification.
What this actually is a piece of human tooth that's been incinerated. So I'm going to put it in the scanning electron microscope here, and we're now at 2000x magnification.
Peter Bush is a research scientist at the State University of New York at Buffalo.
This is telling us the elemental composition of different brands of tooth color filling.
He demonstrates how a tooth fragment is used to identify remains.
It's been incinerated, and the tooth color filling is identified by brand as tetric ceram from Ivoclar.
Dental records reveal the individual's treatment history.
The dentist did write in the dental chart that they used tetric ceram on tooth number 23.
There's no dispute about this branch of forensic odontology.
And so we have now a piece of scientifically verifiable information that assists us to be certain in victim identification.
But bite mark evidence is another story. Mary Bush is a dentist, researcher, and teacher at SUNY Buffalo Dental School of Medicine. In 2007, the husband and wife team were prodded by one of Mary's graduate students to test the reliability of bite mark evidence.
Nice job with the overall contour.
Bite marks was one of those areas that we said that we're not going to get into because it was just a very contentious field.
Yeah, the walls are nice and smooth.
This is just something we didn't want to enter into, but the student was pretty adamant that he wanted to do a bite mark research project.
The Bushes agreed.
We really had to be careful about the scientific rigor that we used to talk about bite marks.
We decided to start with some very basic research. How does skin respond when bitten?
Which is why we went back to the skin literature in the medical field to understand the true properties of skin.
No one had scientifically tested the premise of bite mark analysis using human skin. Their research project was granted access to cadavers through the Anatomical Gift Program. To create the bite markings, they built a sensitive mechanical device using a dental mold that mimicked the force of a human jaw. But they didn't get reliable matches. The Bushes learned that skin distorts and it stretches, and when it stretches, it moves differently in different directions.
We found that all of the bite marks that we were test biting with looked different from the set of teeth that actually created those bites.
The team also changed the position of the teeth and even removed teeth to see what would be reflected in the bite marks.
Some of the bites looked like the teeth were still there, even though they were not part of the biting dentition.
The stunning results. No 2 sets of bite marks made by the same set of teeth looked the same. A basic tenet of bite mark analysis was completely wrong.
The nature of the skin is not a good recording medium. It just does not capture that detail with fidelity.
Bite mark analysis has always been performed by odontologists, dental experts. Nowhere in the discipline are there experts on skin. The Bushes' results revealed that weakness. As they delved deeper, their findings would fly in the face of another basic tenet, that the arrangement or condition of teeth, known as dentition, is unique to each individual. It's an assumption carried over from victim identification.
So in victim identification, you're comparing x-rays of the whole mouth, you're comparing dental records as to which teeth are there, which are missing, whether there are fillings in the teeth, and on what surface of the tooth are those fillings.
Even if skin did accurately record a dentition, the bite mark would offer a very limited amount of information.
All you have is the biting surfaces, maybe the 6 front teeth, sometimes 8 teeth will be in a bite, but you lose almost all of that information.
David Sheets is a professor of physics and director of the Data Analytics Graduate Program at Canisius College in Buffalo, New York. Using techniques similar to facial recognition software, he specializes in precision measurements. He collaborated with the Bushes to quantify the distinctiveness of dentitions.
Now, there may be a fundamental uniqueness to the dental structure, but there's also a question of what can you measure? If you can't measure that difference, it's not really relevant.
First, they had to determine just how accurately you could measure teeth.
If you measure the same individual over and over and over again, you don't get the same answer. You get a little bit of scatter all the time. It's always the case with any measurement technology.
Researchers spent months meticulously measuring dentitions and tabulating that data.
And we built up some really big databases, right? The largest one was well over 1,000 individuals.
The results were surprising.
So what we saw was that in reasonably sized data sets, 400 sets of dentition from a random population, you'd find one or two individuals in that who had a match within the population. So in other words, you couldn't tell their teeth apart.
This defies another tenet of bite mark analysis, that an individual's teeth are unique. They also compared the teeth of people who'd had orthodontic treatment. Incredibly, out of 110 people, 40 of them had matching bites.
That was really the end point. It definitively showed that people can be the same, can have the same arrangement of their teeth.
The bottom line is that skin doesn't record bite marks with any reliability or accuracy, and many individuals share a similar bite.
So it's a pretty devastating conclusion, right? So if you take that just in itself, right, it should have been enough to question the entire field.
The Bushes began publishing the results in scientific journals in 2009. Soon after, they were being asked to testify. Prosecutors and bite mark analysts pushed back.
What they did was that they made this, well, that doesn't reflect real-world circumstances. That's totally irrelevant to what we do. We deal with bite marks that are partially inflicted during a violent struggle, after healing, after decomposing. All the things that make bite marks impossible were what they claimed were the reasons why you had to ignore and discredit the Bush research.
The rejection of the Bushes' scientific study is based on the fact that it was done in a laboratory under controlled variables.
So when we hear, derogatory terms and we're using dead skin and we're using a device, but we're like, yes, but we're getting this level of distortion using these simplistic devices that we can't possibly make it better by adding more variables.
Their primary critics are from the organization that certifies forensic dentists, the American Board of Forensic Odontology, or ABFO. Allied with the National District Attorneys Association, both are powerful organizations. But scientists and legal scholars supported the Bushes' findings. The same year they began testifying, the National Academy of Sciences issued a groundbreaking report which found substantial rates of erroneous results in bite mark analysis.
We felt we had a moral duty to publish these results and that other people in the field should know the problems with bite mark analysis.
The Bushes were not the first scientists to sound the alarm about the fundamental flaws of bite mark analysis. In the 1990s, a study came from inside the ABFO, conducted by one of its members. Bite mark analysts were asked to match bite marks to the dentitions that made them. The results? The analysts were incorrect 50% of the time. The ABFO dismissed the findings, and when the researcher who ran the study went public, the organization retaliated with an ethics complaint and meritless lawsuits. States continued to allow bite mark evidence, even as scientific studies failed to validate it. Until one Texas case forced a state agency to make a move.
Stephen Chaney was wrongfully convicted in Texas and served 28 years in prison for a homicide he did not commit.
In 1987, 31-year-old Stephen Chaney was convicted of the home invasion murder of a Dallas couple. During his trial, 2 bite mark analysts from the ABFO testified, saying,
"A bite mark on the victim was a match for Stephen Chaney."
There was 1 in a million chance it belonged to someone else.
Nearly 3 decades later, a team from the Innocence Project, including Chris Fabricant, took on the case. One of the original bite mark experts had passed away, but the other recanted his statement, admitting his conclusions were scientifically unsound. Stephen Chaney was acquitted and then formally exonerated in 2019.
And in conjunction with our representation of Mr. Chaney, we filed a complaint with the Texas Forensic Science Commission, asking the commission to do a deep dive into the literature and some of the assumptions surrounding bite mark evidence and produce a report, not just about Mr. Chaney's case, but about bite marks in general.
The Texas Forensic Science Commission is made up of 7 scientists and 2 lawyers, all appointed by the governor.
And what the commission does is we create licensing for forensic science disciplines, as well as create policies and practices which can be used by the crime labs. Let's see what else is in.
Commission member Dr. Jasmine Drake is a forensic chemist at Texas Southern University.
What we really care about is about the science and really making sure that quality in the analysis as well as great reliability.
My name is Chris Fabricant. I'm the Director of Strategic Litigation at the Innocence Project in New York. The commission did a 6-month investigation into what evidence there was, if any, to support some of what courts have been accepting for at least 50 years.
We have to create a system where we have trained people on the review. I don't think that's the point of what we're doing. There's always going to be the road.
The commission spoke to scientists, attorneys, and odontologists from the ABFO. Dr. Ashraf Mozoyani was a member of the commission during the investigation.
It was really heated meetings. I'd never had a meeting like that before in any of the other investigation that we did.
Mozoyani, a professor of forensic toxicology, asked the presenters if all dentists were qualified to analyze bite marks and testify in court. Their answer shocked her.
So they didn't need any training, nothing. They could just become a forensic odontologist, every dentist.
The most eye-opening moment for the commission came when they heard testimony about another study done within the ABFO.
And what it was an effort to validate the threshold issue with bite mark evidence, right? Is it or is it not a bite mark? And so they sent out 100 of these photographs of injuries to 39 of most senior practicing board-certified diplomates, and to get their opinions as to whether or not this was a human bite mark or not.
Out of 100 case studies, the analysts came to a unanimous agreement on just 4.
A lot of the forensic dentists could not determine if something was actually even a bite mark or if it was a human bite mark. That was very disturbing.
You knew that there is no science in it, that's all.
It was a dismal failure.
And so, based on that, the commission was actually unanimous about creating a moratorium on bite mark evidence in the state of Texas.
The commission issued a report affirming there's no scientific basis for stating that a particular patterned injury can be associated to an individual's dentition, and a scathing rebuke of ABFO.
If anyone should take responsibility for the current state of bite mark comparison, it is the very organization of practitioners that, due to its glacial pace, reticence to publish critical data, and willingness to allow overstatements of science to go unchecked for decades, is facing a barrage of well-founded criticism.
Even though we're talking about evidence, this evidence is connected to people. Real people who end up doing sometimes 20, 30 years or spending a lifetime in prison based on some of this evidence. So we have a duty to get it right.
To unearth potential wrongful convictions, Chris Fabricant went deep into the ABFO archives.
And it was really eerie sitting in there, going through boxes and boxes of documents from historical records, knowing that so many of these historical records are people, and people who are in prison, and victims of crimes.
In 2016, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, or PCAST, issued a report on forensics. PCAST considers the prospects of developing bite mark analysis into a scientifically valid method to be low. We advise against devoting significant resources to such efforts. The National District Attorneys Association rejected the report.
If I were to have taken the PCAST report seriously, which I did not, or the
PCAST specifically noted the study done by Mary and Peter Bush. The District Attorneys Association attempted to discredit their work by sending a misleading letter to President Obama. The Bushes had no agenda, other than helping a graduate student with a project.
Now, if the research that we had done had shown that bite mark evidence was reliable and could be reproducible, obviously we would have published that as well.
But powerful players continue to push back.
We believe that comparative identification disciplines such as bite mark evidence, tire and footwear impressions are reliable science.
Once the science changes and the technology shows that things are changing, some of them are resistant to that change.
Keith Harward is lending his voice to the conversation. A reminder that bad science has a human cost.
Explain to me, what does it take to realize this stuff's all crap? Why use bite mark evidence when just this year alone, 2 other people besides myself have gotten out and bite mark evidence was used in the trial? I mean, how many people have to be wrongly convicted before they realize that this stuff's all bogus? It's all made up.
The trauma of wrongful convictions is not reserved solely for those imprisoned.
I mean, it's been a struggle. It has.
In 1985, 3-year-old Chad McCrory was asleep in his bed when his 24-year-old mother was murdered just down the hall in their living room. He remembers nothing of that night.
I've got a lot of time and a lot of effort trying to find the truth.
Several months later, he lost another parent when his father, Charles McCrory, was convicted of the murder and sentenced to life in prison. Chad was raised by his grandparents.
They were very adamant that I make my own decision about the case, about things that had happened.
There was never anything that actually tied Mr. McCrory to the crime. There was no eyewitness, there was no confession, there was no forensic evidence, and there was no motive.
What there was a bite mark, or at least something prosecutors claimed was a bite mark. 34 years later, the case came to the attention of Chris Fabricant at the Innocence Project and Mark Loudon Brown at the Southern Center for Human Rights.
So I got the file, read the transcript, and thought there's just no way this conviction should stand.
In 1985, Charles McCrory was a 26-year-old computer programmer in Andalusia, Alabama. He volunteered as an auxiliary policeman and paramedic. He'd recently separated from his wife, Julie, who had been his high school sweetheart.
They started dating. Julie was probably no older than 14. And she was always around, just like one of us. My parents loved Julie just like they did the rest of the family.
Renee McCrory Smith and Laura McCrory Grizzett are Charles's younger sisters.
How old were you here? 11.
Both were very close to Julie.
We were best friends. We rode to school together, graduated from high school together, in each other's weddings.
Charles and Julie married in May 1980, and 2 years later, Chad was born. By the time he was 3, the couple had decided to separate.
They were still in a relationship, but they were going through a divorce.
By all accounts, they were on friendly terms.
Charles had got an apartment. She went with him, picked out his furniture. So he'd been to the beach on the Monday before she was killed. They had spent the day at the beach together with Chad.
The night of May 30th, 1985. Charles is over at Julie and Chad's house. They watch TV together while he does some laundry.
All right, kiddo. Bedtime. Come here, little one. Sure, Chatterbongo.
And then he left at some point in the evening.
See you in the morning. All right, take care. All right.
And was gone for the rest of the night.
The next morning, Charles rings Julie from work because he'd forgotten his breakfast and hoped she'd drop it off for him. But he doesn't get an answer. Worried, he calls his parents.
Julie?
His father, C.H., goes to the house to check on Julie and Chad.
Julie?
He finds the body of his daughter-in-law. She has been savagely beaten and stabbed multiple times. Chad is safe in his bedroom.
Hey, buddy.
Charles is headed to the house when he hears the emergency call on his radio scanner.
Dispatch, this is McCrory. I'll go check that out.
It's Julie.
Julie!
Julie is lying on her stomach with a bandana around her wrist and a bloody wound in the back of her head.
And Mr. McCrory allegedly said something like, was it the lick to the back of her head that killed her?
The detectives, naturally suspicious of the soon-to-be ex-husband, find this to be an odd question. They also suspect he has blood on his shoe. It is enough to make him a suspect.
Mr. McCrory, he fully cooperated. He gave them a couple of different interviews.
Got home around 9:30, I think.
They searched his house, his car, his shoes, his clothes, and they didn't find anything connecting him in any way to the murder.
They analyzed scrapings from under Julie's fingernails.
We had our issues,
but the material does not belong to Charles. Neither does the hair found in her hand. And the stain on his shoe isn't blood at all. Still, he remains the only suspect.
What happened was that after he became a suspect, they started to try to develop evidence.
They find a neighbor who says he may have seen Charles's truck in the driveway all night.
So in other words, that he had never left that night was this neighbor's testimony. So we sent an investigator over 40 years later, but the property lines haven't changed, and you could not see that truck in the driveway from the vantage point that that witness had claimed to be able to see that truck.
Then the investigators find their smoking gun.
When they noticed an injury on the body that looked to somebody like a bite mark, and I have looked at it very carefully more than once, and it looks nothing like a bite mark to me. But they got that bite mark evidence and they shipped it off to Dick Souveron.
Dr. Richard Souveron was one of the star dentists who testified in Ted Bundy's trial.
And Dick Souveron decided that it was a bite mark and matched Mr. McCrory to that bite mark.
The Monday of the funeral, we were at the funeral. As soon as it was over, he went in for questioning, And then later that afternoon, I actually heard from a relative that they were going to arrest him.
He is charged with murder. The state offers him a plea deal instead of going to trial.
He was offered like 8 to 10 years and would possibly serve 5 to 6, and he'd be out.
Charles refuses to take the deal that would have required him to plead guilty.
Throughout the trial, it just seemed everything was kind of like a joke. You know, they had fingerprints, and they were like, well, they're Charles's. I'm like, well, of course they're Charles's.
Charles was often in the home, and until recently had lived there. Dr. Souveron was the prosecution's star witness.
You know, he had a lot of clout when he come into, especially into a small town.
They saved him for the end, right? He concluded his testimony saying, it's Mr. McCrory's teeth on her body, and he did it at the time of death.
It's hard not to think, you know, hey, yes, they know what they're talking about. There's no question about it.
Charles McCrory was found guilty for the murder of his wife and sentenced to life in prison.
Biting somebody, it has this, you know, animalistic feel, like that somebody is biting another person. You have to really think about what's going on in the courtroom when an expert is saying this guy bit her at the time of death. Bit her, right? You can't overcome that.
For more than 30 years, his family has stood by him.
Anytime I read an article that has someone that's been trying to deal with bite mark evidence or junk science, I'll write them, ask them if they can help me in any way. I have no idea how many people I've written to.
Laura finally succeeded in finding her brother a legal team. Their first move was to try to get DNA from crime scene evidence.
But that all has somehow disappeared. We've looked for the evidence, we've been told it no longer exists, and we don't know why.
They did have the supposed bite mark assessed by prominent forensic dentists.
We showed them the evidence, and they said it's not a bite mark at all. It's literally just 2 dots.
He said, I can make anyone's teeth match these marks. You know, I mean, we're talking about 2 marks.
Then they reached out to the prosecution's key witness, Dr. Richard Souveron.
Said, would you take a look at this, knowing what you know now, and just see if you agree, if you stand by your opinions. And he provided us with a sworn affidavit saying that given his decades of experience as a forensic dentist, what he knows now about the limitations of bite mark analysis and comparison, he would no longer testify that way. And that today he could not and he would not testify that this was Mr. McCrory's bite mark.
In 2018, the ABFO made significant restrictions to its standards and guidelines, no longer allowing members to express conclusions unconditionally linking a bite mark to a dentition. But they are still allowed to testify whether or not someone can be excluded, a potentially dangerous exception.
When you exclude somebody, you're using the same level of certainty that you would if you were naming somebody the biter. So if you exclude the wrong person, you still have the same problem.
In the spring of 2021, McCrory's new legal team met up in Andalusia, Alabama. The night before the evidentiary hearing, the prosecutor made a surprising offer.
She said that if he would plead guilty, they would agree to time served, that he could go home.
Charles would have been required to admit guilt and to explain to the court how he committed the murder.
Mr. McCrory turned it down. Could have walked out of prison, but he was not willing to plead guilty to a crime he didn't commit.
We spoke with him right after that had happened, and he was like, you know, I had that chance back 36 years ago. I turned it down. He said, I don't know why they would ask me again.
The following day, the defense presented their case to the court.
In 1985, there was one piece of evidence against Mr. McCrory. It was a bite mark. And they thought at that time that bite marks were good science. And now we know that they're not. And so he should get out.
But overturning any wrongful conviction is an uphill battle.
There are legislative roadblocks, there are political roadblocks, there's fear of litigation. There are so many disincentives to seriously considering whether tragic miscarriage of justice has occurred.
Seeking justice for Julie has also remained important for the McCrory family.
We loved Julie like she was our sister.
It was very devastating, very confusing.
You just want to know what happened. I want to know who did it.
There was other physical evidence that was present at the crime scene that suggested the identity of a different attacker.
There was a construction worker that was known to wear a red bandana right next door to the crime scene that 4 months after this murder was committed, he was convicted of a home invasion rape and served 20 years in prison. That person was never seriously investigated as a suspect in the crime that Mr. McCrory was convicted of.
During his decades in prison, Charles has gotten a PhD in religious studies. He preaches in the prison church and mentors other inmates.
My mother got joy when we would be in line to go in to see him, that other mothers would walk up to her and tell her what good he had done for their son, and that just, really lit her up.
Both of Charles's parents have passed away.
And during our parents' sickness and death, I think that's one of the hardest parts, is that, him not being able to be here for either one of them.
McCrory and his family waited an agonizing 10 months before Covington County, Alabama judge Charles Short issued his decision. In spite of the expert witness recanting his testimony and the emergence of scientific evidence, Judge Short was unconvinced that the outcome of the trial would have been different, and refused to grant Charles McCrory a new hearing.
I was stunned by the decision. I was stunned by the reasoning of the decision.
The ruling said that it didn't matter that Dr. Souveron recanted his testimony, because anyone on the jury could have seen that Mr. McCrory's teeth were a match for the bite mark.
So this decision suggests that rather than using an expert witness, you would ask a lay juror to eyeball some injury and associate it with Mr. McCrory is, in my mind, really just a perversion of logic and justice.
I think the bigger problem here is everybody agrees this isn't a bite mark. So even if that were true, even if lay jurors were just as good as experts at matching dentition to a bite mark, this isn't a bite mark. So what are you matching?
The judge also cited the eyewitness who said he saw McCrory's truck in the driveway as justification for his decision.
The prosecution brought him in to testify, and the judge had to cut him off mid-testimony because he didn't make any sense. The judge cut him off and struck his testimony.
The substance of the judge's decision wasn't the only thing that stunned the defense team. Months earlier, District Attorney Walt Merrill and Chief Assistant District Attorney Grace Jeter submitted a 4-page brief arguing against McCrory's request for a new trial. Judge Short's 4-page decision was a near duplicate of the brief submitted by the district attorneys.
We submitted something like a 40-page brief. It doesn't address any of the points we raised. And so it's clear that there was no honest legal analysis going on. And that, I think, is both the process and the substance are, as Chris said, just particularly shocking.
And it's a really good example of just how hard it is to overturn a conviction, and a really good reason why we should stop admitting unvalidated and unreliable evidence in criminal trials, because it's really almost impossible to overturn, even when you have such plain facts as you have in this case.
McCrory's defense team is planning to appeal Judge Short's decision. The process will likely take years. Setting the record straight on bite marks is an enormous challenge.
We cannot rely on courts to separate nonsense from science. We have to have scientists do that.
Science inherently moves forward, but the law looks to the past.
The law relies on precedent to keep moving forward. And science, the idea is to challenge precedent.
Poorly reasoned precedents embedded in the system are nearly impossible to overturn. To combat the dilemma, the Supreme Court ruled in 1993 that judges should be the gatekeepers for expert testimony in their courtrooms.
There are standards that could be used to exclude unreliable evidence if judges want to. It just doesn't happen.
Instead, judges rely on juries to decide how much weight they will give to evidence.
But the reality is that once you are in trial, once you have a jury impaneled, the defendant has 2 strikes against them, and trying to cross your way out of a junk science conviction is impossible.
To date, bite mark comparison evidence has been used to secure at least 33 indictments and convictions that have later been overturned.
And still today, it's admissible in all 50 states. Right now, today, still admissible today.
After his release, Stephen Chaney spent his time as a prison missionary and playing gospel music. He passed away on May 17, 2021. In 2017, the Virginia legislature awarded Keith Harward $1.6 million. A drop in the bucket compared to the money the state spent on his wrongful conviction and imprisonment.
There's all kind of victims that came from this case. The taxpayer of Virginia who pays millions and millions of dollars just for my case alone. 2 trials and compensation. Millions and millions of dollars that they could build schools with that were wasted.
But the settlement makes a big difference in his life.
This is my retirement. I put in a lot of time for this.
The most remarkable thing I think about Keith, among many things, is his lack of bitterness and hostility. He doesn't have a chip on his shoulder. He's grateful for the life he has now.
Today, Harward and his girlfriend travel the country on his refurbished bus, advocating for others.
Some would say, well, you're a free man. I will never be free of this. There's no possibility. Excuse me if I get emotional.
Only by chance was Keith still alive to be freed.
It was a capital case. I could have got the death penalty, and the state would have legally executed me years ago.
At the sentencing hearing, Keith's parents testified. I think his mother probably saved his life.
But it's just not right, and I'm doing everything I can to help. But I'm just one person. I feel that's the reason why I can be here now and tell my story. It's my responsibility to do this.